Dallas, Texas, the spring of 1973. A Saturday morning in a hotel ballroom on Commerce Street, 4 blocks from the Adolphus Hotel, in the kind of room that convention centers keep for events that need more floor space than a conference room but less ceremony than a banquet hall. The chairs had been cleared from the center and stacked against the far wall. The carpet had been covered with interlocking foam mats that ran the length of the room in 2 parallel rows, 20 feet wide and 40 feet long. At the front of the room, a portable podium had been set up with a microphone that was not being used because the man teaching the seminar did not need a microphone. His voice carried without effort, the way voices carry when the person producing them has spent years speaking to rooms and has learned to fill space with projection rather than volume. His name was Chuck Norris. He was 32 years old. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall and 170 pounds, and he had been a professional martial arts competitor for 9 years and had won the World Professional Middleweight Karate Championship for the previous 3 years running and had, in the previous 18 months, begun transitioning out of competition and into teaching and film work with the specific focus of a man who has decided what the next phase of his life is going to look like and is now building it. The seminar had been advertised in 4 Texas martial arts publications and in the regional insert of Black Belt magazine. 312 people had paid the registration fee. They had come from Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, and from as far as Amarillo and Lubbock. They were a serious crowd. Tournament competitors, dojo owners, senior students, a handful of men who had been training since before Chuck Norris had his first black belt. They had paid to be in this room because the man teaching it was the best tournament karate competitor of his generation and because the gap between watching someone compete and watching them teach was a gap that serious practitioners understood was worth crossing for the right instructor. Not every champion could teach. The history of martial arts was full of men who had competed at the highest level and had found, when they stood in front of a room and tried to transfer what they knew, that what they knew existed in their bodies and not in language, and that the translation from body to language was a skill as distinct from the physical skill as the physical skill was from anything else. Chuck Norris had found the translation. The people who had attended his previous seminars in Houston and Phoenix and Denver had said so in the specific way that serious practitioners say something is good, which is by returning and by bringing people they respected. The seminar had begun at 9 in the morning. It was now 10:45. Chuck Norris had been teaching for an hour and 45 minutes without a break, moving through the material with the organized precision of a man who had prepared carefully and was executing the preparation rather than improvising around it. He had covered footwork in the first 30 minutes, and the footwork section alone had been worth the registration fee for the 24 people in the room who had been teaching footwork for years without being able to articulate why the version they taught worked in some situations and failed in others. Norris had articulated it in 7 minutes, using 3 pairs of students as live demonstrations, moving them into and out of positions with the quiet efficiency of a man who has spent 9 years developing a precise physical vocabulary and has now spent 3 years learning to translate that vocabulary into language. Distance management in the second. Combination theory in the third. He was now in the 4th section, which was the application of everything that had preceded it, the point in a seminar where the abstract becomes concrete and the students stop listening and start feeling. The 312 people on the mats were engaged in the specific focused way that serious practitioners engage when the instruction is good and the material is applicable and the gap between what they came in knowing and what they are learning is visible and measurable. There were nods. There were the sounds of partners working techniques and stopping and working them again. There were questions from the floor that Norris answered with the directness of someone who had answered similar questions for 9 years and had learned which answers were true and which were plausible sounding but incomplete. In the back of the room, near the stacked chairs, There were 12 people who had arrived late and had not found floor space near the front and had set themselves up along the back wall with their partners and were working in the reduced space available to them. One of them had arrived later than the others. He had come in through the side door at 10:15, 45 minutes into the seminar. He had signed the registration sheet at the table near the door. He had found a space at the far left end of the back row, along the wall, and had begun working the material quietly with the man next to him, who had not recognized him when he arrived and had simply made room the way you make room for a latecomer. His name was Joe Louis. He was 29 years old. He was 6 feet tall and 195 pounds, and he was the reigning heavyweight full-contact champion of America, and he had driven 4 hours from his home in Oklahoma City that morning because someone had told him that Chuck Norris was teaching a seminar in Dallas, and he had decided that he wanted to see what Chuck Norris taught when he was not competing. Joe Louis and Chuck Norris had a specific history that the 312 people in the room would have recognized if they had known it was relevant. It was not a secret history. It was documented in the results sheets of 2 major tournaments, available to anyone who followed the sport closely enough to read results sheets. But tournament results sheets do not travel far outside the community of people who attend tournaments, and the 312 people in the room were a cross-section of serious Texas practitioners who knew Chuck Norris's record the way fans know records and who knew Joe Louis's name but did not necessarily know the specific outcomes of specific fights between 2 men who had competed in circuits that overlapped but were not identical. What they knew about Norris was comprehensive. What they knew about Louis was the outline of a reputation rather than the details of a record. Neither of them knew that both men were in the same room. The information, when it arrived, would arrive in pieces. They had competed against each other twice in tournament settings. Louis had won both times. The wins had been close, the kind of close that is decided by a single technique landing cleanly rather than a systemic difference in ability. But Louis had won them and Norris had lost them, and both men understood the specific meaning of that record with the unsentimental clarity of serious competitors who do not inflate or deflate results. They had not seen each other since the second fight, which had been 14 months earlier. Louis had not contacted Norris to say he was coming. He had paid the registration fee at the door like everyone else. He had not given his full name on the sign-in sheet, only his first name and his city of origin, which was common enough that no one at the registration table had looked twice at it. He had arrived at the back of the room and begun working and had given no indication, in the 45 minutes since his arrival, that he was anything other than a serious practitioner who had come to learn. Chuck Norris did not see him for another 20 minutes. He was moving through the room as he taught, the way good instructors move, stopping to correct a specific student's technique, demonstrating a detail at close range for a pair who had a question, keeping the room working while he circulated. He reached the back of the room at 11:05. He was moving along the back wall from right to left, stopping at each pair, saying something specific and moving on. He reached the second pair from the left end of the back row. He corrected the man's lead foot angle. He moved to the next pair. He looked at the man on the left. He looked at the man's partner. He looked back at the man on the left. He stopped. The stop was not dramatic. It was simply a stop. The stop of a man whose movement has been interrupted by the arrival of information that requires processing before movement can continue. He looked at Joe Louis for 3 seconds. Then he said, in a voice quiet enough that only the people in the immediate vicinity heard it, that he had not seen Louis's name on the registration list. Louis said that he had signed in under his first name. He said it in the same flat tone he used for everything, the tone of a man providing a piece of information rather than making an excuse or an explanation. Norris looked at him for another second. Then he did something that none of the people nearby had expected. He smiled. Not the practiced smile of a man performing warmth for an audience. The specific smile of a man who has just understood something that amuses him genuinely, which was that the best heavyweight fighter in America had driven 4 hours to sit in the back row of his seminar and work the material quietly for 45 minutes without telling anyone he was there. He said that Lewis was welcome to the front of the room if he preferred. Lewis said that the back was fine. He said it without inflection, the way a man says something when the statement is complete and he has nothing to add to it and is not interested in the conversation that would follow if he added something. The back was fine because Lewis had not come to the front. He had come to learn what Norris taught, and the back of the room was as good a place to learn it as the front, and the fact that he was Joe Lewis and that Chuck Norris was teaching and that 2 years earlier those two facts had been arranged differently did not change the quality of the instruction or the value of being in the room to receive it. He said it without any particular emphasis. He said it the way a man says something when he means it exactly and has no subtext to add. Norris stood at the back of the room for a moment. He was 32 years old and he had been teaching martial arts for 3 years, and he had, in those 3 years, developed a specific philosophy about what a seminar was for and what it was not for. A seminar was not a performance. It was not an occasion for the instructor to demonstrate superiority over the students. It was an environment for the transfer of specific information from someone who had worked something out to people who had not yet worked it out, and the quality of that transfer was measured by what the students could do at the end of the seminar that they could not do at the beginning. He had also, in those 3 years, developed a specific awareness of what happened in a seminar room when the most accomplished person in the room was not the instructor, and he had learned that this situation could go 2 directions. It could become competitive, which produced nothing useful for anyone. Or it could become collaborative, which produced something that neither the instructor nor the accomplished student could produce alone. He made a decision in the 2 seconds he stood at the back of the room looking at Joe Lewis. He raised his voice to carry across the room. He said that he was going to ask Lewis to demonstrate the previous combination from his own base. He said it as a request rather than a command. He said it in the tone of a teacher who has just found a resource in the room that he did not know was there and is now incorporating it. The 312 people on the mats turned toward the back wall. Joe Lewis stepped to the center of the cleared space that formed near him as people moved back. He did not take a formal position or adjust his clothing or perform any of the preparations that men perform when they are about to demonstrate something in front of a crowd. He simply stood in the space and waited. Norris named the combination he wanted to see. Lewis executed it once, at training speed, with the economy of a man for whom the movement was internalized rather than recalled. He executed it again at a higher speed. Then he executed it against the man who had been his partner for the previous 45 minutes, at the resistance level the seminar had been working at, and the 312 people watching saw the combination function in a way that the previous hour and 45 minutes of instruction had described, but that none of them had yet seen at the level at which it could function. The room made a specific sound. Not applause. Not a collective breath. Something between those two things, the sound a room makes when it has just seen the distance between its own level and the level above it made visible and measurable in a single demonstration. Norris watched the demonstration with the complete attention he brought to things that were teaching him something. Then he incorporated what he had seen into the final 40 minutes of the seminar, adjusting 2 elements of the combination theory he had been presenting based on what Lewis's execution had shown him about where his own analysis had been slightly incomplete. He did this without any indication that the adjustment was unusual or that incorporating information from a student into a seminar in real time was anything other than normal practice. After the seminar ended, the 2 men spoke for 20 minutes near the registration table while the room cleared around them. The conversation was technical. It was about the specific mechanical questions that the morning had raised for both of them, The questions that a seminar produces when the instruction is good enough to answer the questions the students came in with and to reveal the next layer of questions underneath those. It was about distance and timing and the specific relationship between the two that changes when a fighter moves from point competition to full contact work, a transition that Norris was planning and that Lewis had already made, which gave the conversation the specific texture of a discussion between a man who has crossed a territory and a man who is preparing to cross it and wants to know what the crossing requires. It was not a conversation about their competitive history or about who had won what or about the relative merits of their respective approaches to a sport that was still defining itself in 1973 and would not settle into its final form for another decade. It was the conversation of two men who had spent the morning in the same room working on the same problem from different positions and who had found that the problem was more interesting than either of them had understood it to be before the morning began. 312 people drove home from Dallas that Saturday afternoon carrying something they had not driven in with, which was the specific understanding that the distance between teaching a thing and being corrected by the demonstration of it, and incorporating that correction in real time in front of everyone who is watching, is not a diminishment. It is the highest form of instruction. And that the man who drove 4 hours to sit quietly in the back row of a seminar taught by someone he had beaten twice was demonstrating something about learning that had nothing to do with winning or losing and everything to do with the understanding that a man who has stopped being willing to be a student has stopped growing, regardless of what his record says.